what we refuse to see. There is a part of you that you have never met, a stranger living in your own psyche, carrying everything you have rejected, everything you have denied, everything you believe yourself not to be. This stranger knows you intimately, shadows your every move, influences your choices in ways you do not recognize, erupts into your life at unexpected moments with devastating force. Carl Jung called this the shadow, and his dark truth about it is this: you cannot become whole without facing what you most refuse to see in yourself. The shadow is not simply your flaws or your mistakes. It is everything you have pushed into the unconscious because it did not fit the image you wanted to maintain, because acknowledging it would threaten your self-concept, because admitting it would force you to see yourself as you actually are, rather than as you wish to be. It contains your disowned aggression, your unacknowledged selfishness, your hidden cruelty, your secret desires, your forbidden thoughts. But it also contains gold, potentials you never developed, gifts you never claimed, capacities you rejected because they did not fit who you were supposed to be. Jung understood that what we do not bring to consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The shadow we refuse to face does not disappear. It manifests in our relationships, destroying what we try to build. It appears in our self-sabotage, undermining what we consciously want. It emerges in our judgments of others, revealing what we cannot see in ourselves. It possesses us in moments of rage or lust or hatred, acting through us while we claim we are not responsible. The dark truth is not that the shadow exists. The dark truth is that we need it, that wholeness requires embracing what we have rejected, that becoming conscious means facing the monster we have been fleeing, that the path to light leads through darkness. This is Jung's most challenging and most necessary teaching, the nature of the shadow. Jung's discovery. Carl Jung's discovery of the shadow was not merely theoretical. It emerged from his own terrifying descent into the unconscious, from his confrontation with what he called his own inner demons, from years of struggling with patients whose symptoms revealed forces operating beneath conscious awareness. Jung understood the shadow not as an abstract concept, but as a living reality, a psychic presence with its own autonomy, its own intentions, its own power to shape our lives. The shadow, Jung wrote, is the person you would rather not be. It is composed of everything about yourself that you refuse to acknowledge, everything that contradicts your conscious self-image, everything that threatens the persona you have carefully constructed. If you believe yourself to be kind, your shadow contains your cruelty. If you pride yourself on rationality, your shadow contains your irrationality. If you identify as strong, your shadow contains your weakness. The shadow is the negative of your conscious personality, containing precisely what you insist you are not. But Jung's insight went deeper than this. He recognized that the shadow is not simply negative in the moral sense. It is negative in the photographic sense, the inverse image, the opposite polarity. The shadow contains not just our vices, but our unlived potentials, not just our darkness, but our rejected light. The person who has lived a conventional, safe, respectable life has a shadow full of wildness, creativity, passion, all the possibilities they rejected in order to be acceptable. This means the shadow is both dangerous and necessary. Dangerous because it contains impulses that could destroy our lives if acted upon unconsciously. Necessary because it contains energies essential for wholeness, capacities we need but have disowned, aspects of ourselves without which we remain incomplete, half alive, performing a version of life rather than actually living. Jung distinguished between the personal shadow and the collective shadow. The personal shadow contains material specific to our individual history, the particular aspects of ourselves we learnt to hide based on our unique experiences, our family dynamics, our cultural context. But beneath the personal shadow lies something more primordial, what Jung called the collective shadow, containing the darker aspects of human nature itself, the capacity for violence and cruelty and evil that is not learned, but inherited. not personal, but archetypal. This collective shadow is why, as Jung wrote, everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. We do not create the capacity for darkness through personal failing. We are born with it, inheritors of millions of years of evolution, during which violence and deception and cruelty were often necessary for survival. The shadow contains our evolutionary inheritance, the animal within the human, the primitive beneath the civilized. Jung's most disturbing insight was that the shadow cannot be eliminated. It is not a disease to be cured or a problem to be solved. It is a permanent feature of the psyche, an inevitable result of having consciousness at all. To be conscious means to choose some things and reject others, to identify with some aspects of ourselves and disown others. The moment we say I am this, we create a shadow containing I am not that. Consciousness itself creates the shadow as its necessary opposite. This means that the moral project of becoming purely good, of eliminating all darkness from ourselves, is not just difficult but impossible and, more importantly, psychologically destructive. The attempt to be only light drives the darkness deeper into the unconscious, where it gains power precisely because it is denied. Jung saw clearly that the greatest evils are committed by people who believe themselves to be purely good, who have completely identified with the light and projected all darkness onto others. The shadow operates through specific mechanisms. Repression is the primary one, the pushing out of conscious awareness of anything that threatens our self-image. But the repressed material does not disappear. It sinks into the unconscious, where it forms complexes, autonomous splinters of psyche with their own energy and intention. These shadow complexes can act independently of conscious will, seizing control of consciousness at vulnerable moments. Projection is the shadow's most common manifestation. We attribute to others the qualities we cannot acknowledge in ourselves. The person who cannot admit their own aggression sees the world as threatening, sees aggression in others even where it does not exist. The person who has disowned their sexuality sees the world as sexually charged, interprets innocent gestures as seduction. The person who cannot face their own dishonesty sees everyone else as liars and manipulators. Jung understood that what we most strongly react to in others, what triggers our most intense judgments and emotional responses, reveals our own shadow. If we are merely indifferent to a quality in someone else, it is not our shadow. But if we are fascinated or repulsed, if we feel compelled to condemn or are secretly drawn to what we condemn, then we are encountering our own rejected material projected onto another person. The shadow also manifests in slips of the tongue, in accidents, in sudden impulses that seem to come from nowhere. Freud called these parapraxis, but Jung understood them as shadow eruptions, moments when the disowned material briefly takes control, bypassing conscious censorship to express what we refuse to acknowledge. We say the opposite of what we intended, revealing what we actually think. We forget something important, revealing our ambivalence. We act in ways completely out of character, revealing that our character is not as unified as we believe. Jung's work with patients revealed that shadow material often first appears in dreams, where the censorship of consciousness is relaxed. The shadow typically appears as a figure of the same sex as the dreamer, often threatening or criminal or primitive, embodying qualities the dreamer rejects. But sometimes the shadow figure is appealing, attractive, containing potentials the dreamer has not claimed. Working with these dream figures, learning to recognize them as parts of oneself rather than as external threats or temptations, is the beginning of shadow integration. But integration is not easy, and Jung was clear about this. The shadow resists consciousness because it contains what consciousness has defined as unacceptable. To acknowledge the shadow feels like moral failure, like admitting we are who we have always insisted we are not. It requires enormous courage to face what we have spent our lives fleeing, to see in ourselves the qualities we have most condemned in others, to accept that we are capable of what we have always judged as evil or weak or shameful. The formation of the shadow. How we create our dark twin. We are not born with a shadow. We are born whole, containing the full spectrum of human possibility without division, without the split between acceptable and unacceptable, between light and dark. The infant is immoral, expressing all impulses without shame, without the internalized judgment that will later create the shadow. The formation of the shadow is the price we pay for becoming social beings, for developing a coherent sense of self, for belonging to the human community. The process begins early, in the first years of life, when the child is learning which aspects of themselves receive approval and which receive disapproval. The child expresses anger and is punished or shamed. That anger does not disappear, it goes into the shadow. The child shows neediness and is told they are too demanding, too much. That need does not vanish. It sinks into the unconscious. The child displays their body without shame and is taught that the body is shameful, that certain parts must be hidden, that physical pleasure is wrong, that natural relationship to the body goes underground. Every no creates shadow material. Every time the child is told that is not acceptable, that you should not feel that way, that good children do not do such things, a part of the child's wholeness is split off and pushed into darkness. This is not necessarily abuse, though abuse certainly accelerates and intensifies shadow formation. This is simply the inevitable process of socialization, of becoming a person who can function in society, who can control impulses, who understands rules and boundaries. Jung understood that different families and different cultures create different shadows by prohibiting different aspects of human nature. In a family that values achievement and success, the shadow might contain the capacity for rest, for acceptance of limitation, for being ordinary. In a family that values emotional control, the shadow contains spontaneous feeling, tears, vulnerability. In a culture that emphasizes individualism, the shadow might contain the desire for merger, for dependence, for losing oneself in collective identity. This means the shadow is not uniform across people. What one person has rejected, another has embraced. What lives in the shadow for someone from one culture might be fully conscious and integrated for someone from another. The shadow is personal, shaped by unique history, unique family dynamics, unique cultural messages about what is acceptable and what must be hidden. But there are also commonalities. Jung identified certain nearly universal shadow contents in Western culture: the animal nature, the body and its appetites, sexuality, particularly in its more primitive or unconventional forms, aggression and the capacity for violence, selfishness and the desire to serve one's own interests, the capacity for cruelty and domination. Western culture, Jung argued, had become overly identified with rationality, with spirit, with the civilized persona, and had pushed into the collective shadow everything that reminded us of our animal origins. The intensity with which material is pushed into the shadow determines how powerfully it will later manifest. Aspects of ourselves that were severely punished, that brought intense shame or fear of abandonment, become deeply repressed, heavily charged with emotional energy. These deeply repressed aspects form what Jung called shadow complexes, autonomous entities within the psyche with tremendous power to possess consciousness when triggered. The paradox is that what we most strongly repress is often what we most need. The overly controlled person needs access to their wildness, their spontaneity, their capacity to let go. But these qualities have been so severely repressed, associated with such intense danger, that accessing them feels like annihilation. The shadow contains not just what is bad, but what is threatening to the ego's stability, to the identity we have constructed and depend on for coherent functioning. Gender adds another dimension to shadow formation. Jung argued that men typically have feminine aspects in their shadow, what he called the anima, while women have masculine aspects in their shadow, what he called the animus. In cultures with rigid gender roles, boys learn that vulnerability, emotionality, receptivity, the desire to nurture, all must be rejected as feminine and therefore shameful. These qualities go into the shadow. Girls learn that assertion, aggression, intellectual ambition, the desire for power, must be rejected as unfeminine. These go into their shadow. This gendered shadow formation creates immense suffering. Men cut off from their feminine shadow become rigid, emotionally constricted, incapable of intimacy or vulnerability. Women cut off from their masculine shadow become unable to assert themselves, to claim their power, to stand for their truth. Wholeness requires integrating these rejected gender aspects, but this integration threatens the very foundation of identity in cultures organized around rigid gender binaries. The shadow also forms through the mechanism of identification. We observe our parents, our caregivers, and we make unconscious decisions about who we will be and who we will not be. The child of an alcoholic father might vow never to be weak, never to lose control, never to need anything from anyone. Their shadow then contains their own vulnerability, their own needs, their own capacity for surrender. Or they might vow never to be angry or violent like their father, and their shadow contains their legitimate aggression, their capacity to defend themselves, their ability to say no. Jung noticed that we often choose romantic partners who carry our shadow, who embody the qualities we have rejected in ourselves. The overly rational person is attracted to the emotional, spontaneous partner. The controlled person is drawn to the wild one. Initially, this feels like complementarity, like the partner completes us, but eventually we begin to resent in them the very qualities that attracted us because they are uncomfortable reminders of our own disowned aspects. The formation of the shadow is also influenced by trauma. Experiences that overwhelm the psyche, that cannot be integrated, get pushed into the shadow in a particularly fragmentary and charged way. The part of the self that experienced the trauma, along with the emotions and memories associated with it, becomes split off, walled off from normal consciousness. This traumatized material in the shadow carries tremendous energy and can possess consciousness with particular intensity when triggered. Understanding how the shadow forms helps us have compassion for ourselves and others. We did not choose to reject parts of ourselves maliciously. We did so to survive, to belong, to be acceptable to those we depended on. The child who pushed their anger into the shadow was protecting themselves from a parent who could not tolerate the anger. The person who rejected their needs was adapting to an environment where needs were punished or ignored. The shadow formation was adaptive, was the best solution available given the circumstances. But what was once protective becomes limiting. The defenses that helped us survive childhood become prisons in adulthood. The shadow that formed to make us acceptable to others now prevents us from being authentic with ourselves. And so the work of reclaiming the shadow, of integrating what was split off, becomes essential not for moral reasons but for the sake of wholeness, for living fully rather than living as a fragment of what we might be. The shadow's manifestations, projection and possession. The shadow does not remain passively in the unconscious. It is dynamic, active, constantly seeking expression, constantly attempting to become conscious, even as we resist its emergence. Jung identified two primary ways the shadow manifests in our lives: through projection onto others and through possession of consciousness. Understanding these mechanisms is essential because they reveal how the shadow operates invisibly, shaping our experience while we remain convinced we are seeing reality rather than our own rejected material. Projection is the shadow's most common and most deceptive manifestation. We take an aspect of ourselves that we cannot acknowledge and attribute it to someone else. We see in them what we refuse to see in ourselves. The mechanism is automatic, unconscious, operating beneath awareness. We do not decide to project. We simply see the other person as having the quality we have disowned, and this perception feels like objective observation rather than subjective distortion. Jung wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. This is the key to recognizing projection. The qualities that trigger our strongest reactions, positive or negative, are likely projections of our own shadow. If we are merely indifferent to a trait in another person, it is probably not our shadow material. But if we are fascinated, repulsed, intensely attracted, or compulsively judgmental, we are likely seeing our own rejected aspects reflected back to us. The person who cannot acknowledge their own dishonesty sees liars everywhere. The person who has rejected their sexuality sees the world through a sexualized lens, interprets innocent gestures as seduction, sees inappropriate sexual content where none exists. The person who has disowned their aggression sees aggression in others constantly, feels threatened by normal assertiveness, interprets the world as hostile and dangerous. In each case, the projection shapes perception so profoundly that the person genuinely believes they are seeing what is there rather than what they carry within. Projection is particularly powerful in intimate relationships. We choose partners who carry aspects of our shadow, who embody qualities we have rejected in ourselves. Initially, this feels like attraction to someone who is different, who completes us, who provides what we lack. The rational person is drawn to the emotional one, the controlled person to the spontaneous one, the practical person to the dreamer. This is the shadow seeking its own integration through the other. But what begins as attraction often transforms into judgment. The very qualities that drew us to the partner become the qualities we resent. The spontaneity we found exciting becomes irresponsibility. The emotionality we found deep becomes manipulation. The dreaminess we found inspiring becomes impracticality. We are now seeing our own shadow projected onto them, and we condemn in them what we cannot accept in ourselves. Jung understood that withdrawal of projections is one of the most difficult and most important tasks in relationship work. It requires recognizing that what we see in the other person, particularly what we see with intense emotion, may be our own shadow material. This does not mean the other person does not have the quality we perceive. It means our reaction to it, the intensity of our response, reveals something about us rather than just about them. But projection is not limited to individuals. We project our shadow onto groups, onto categories of people, onto entire nations or religions or political movements. This collective projection is extraordinarily dangerous because it justifies dehumanization and violence. When a group carries our projected shadow, when we see them as embodying all the evil we cannot acknowledge in ourselves, then anything we do to them feels righteous, feels like fighting darkness, feels like defending the good. This is how atrocities become possible. The Nazis projected their shadow onto Jews, saw in them all the qualities they could not accept in themselves, and justified genocide as cleansing the world of evil. Every war, every persecution, every instance of collective violence involves shadow projection, the designation of an other who carries what we refuse to see in ourselves. Jung warned that the greater the repression of the shadow, the more violent its projection. The person or culture that insists most strongly on its own purity, its own righteousness, its complete freedom from darkness, this person or culture will project their shadow most intensely and most dangerously. They need an enemy, need someone to embody the evil they deny in themselves, need a target onto which to discharge the shadow material they cannot consciously integrate. Possession is the shadow's more dramatic manifestation. This occurs when shadow contents seize control of consciousness, when we are temporarily taken over by aspects of ourselves we normally keep repressed. Jung called these moments of possession, when we act in ways completely foreign to our usual personality, when we do or say things we later cannot believe we did, when we seem to become someone else entirely. Possession typically occurs when defenses are lowered through stress, fatigue, intoxication, or intense emotion. The controlled person suddenly explodes in rage. The gentle person commits an act of violence. The moral person has an affair. The responsible person abandons their duties. These are not simply mistakes or lapses of judgment. They are shadow possessions, moments when the repressed material overwhelms conscious control and acts through us. The experience of possession is distinctive. People often describe it as watching themselves from outside, as being unable to stop even though they know what they are doing is wrong, as being driven by a force they cannot control. This is because, during possession, Consciousness has been seized by a shadow complex that operates with its own autonomy, its own logic, its own intentions that may be completely opposed to the conscious ego's values. After possession, people typically experience shame and confusion. How could I do that? That is not who I am. But Jung would say it is who you are, a part of you that has been repressed and that erupted when given the opportunity. The task is not to deny this part, but to acknowledge it, to recognize that the shadow is real, is powerful, is capable of overriding conscious intentions when it accumulates enough energy through repression. Dreams provide another arena where the shadow manifests. The shadow figure in dreams, typically of the same sex as the dreamer, embodies rejected qualities in forms the conscious mind can tolerate. The shadow figure might be criminal, violent, sexual, primitive, or alternatively might be admirable, carrying qualities the dreamer needs but has not claimed. Working with these dream figures, dialoguing with them in active imagination, is one of Jung's primary methods for beginning shadow integration. The shadow and evil, the dangerous truth. Jung's most controversial and most important insight about the shadow concerns its relationship to evil. The dark truth he uncovered is this: evil is not something external to the psyche, not something that possesses us from outside, but something that emerges from the shadow, from the rejected and denied aspects of ourselves. And more disturbing still, the people most capable of evil are not those who acknowledge their darkness, but those who believe themselves to be purely good, who have completely identified with the light and projected all evil onto others. Jung studied the rise of Nazism with horrified fascination, trying to understand how an educated, cultured nation could commit such atrocities. His conclusion was shattering. The Nazis were able to commit genocide precisely because they believed themselves to be purely good, to be agents of light fighting against darkness, to be cleansing the world of evil. They had projected their collective shadows so completely onto Jews and other targeted groups that murdering millions felt like a righteous act, like serving a higher purpose. This led Jung to one of his most challenging teachings. The problem is not that humans have a shadow, that we contain the capacity for evil. The problem is that we deny it, that we refuse to acknowledge our darkness, that we insist on seeing ourselves as purely good. This denial does not eliminate evil. It makes evil more likely, more extreme, more destructive, because it operates unconsciously, justified by moral certainty, hidden behind the conviction that we are fighting for the good. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. The person who has never acknowledged their capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for violence, this person is more dangerous than the one who knows their darkness and struggles consciously with it, because the one who denies their shadow will act out their darkness while believing themselves to be good, will harm others while convinced they are helping, will commit atrocities while certain they are serving righteousness. This means that shadow work is not merely personal therapy, it is moral necessity. The person who has faced their own capacity for evil, who has acknowledged the monster within, who has seen clearly that they too could commit terrible acts under certain circumstances, this person has developed the humility and self-awareness necessary to guard against acting on those capacities. They know they are capable of evil, and this knowledge makes them less likely, not more likely, to commit it. But Jung went further with an insight that many find unbearable. He argued that evil cannot be eliminated, cannot be destroyed, cannot be conquered once and for all. Evil is part of the structure of reality, part of the wholeness of existence, the dark pole of a polarity that includes both light and dark. The attempt to create a world of pure good, to eliminate all evil, is not just futile, but dangerous, because it creates shadow on a massive scale, creates collective projections of enormous power, creates the conditions for the very evil it seeks to destroy. This is not moral relativism. Jung was not saying that all actions are equally acceptable, that evil does not exist, that we should not fight against cruelty and injustice. He was saying that the fight against evil must begin with recognition of evil in ourselves, that we must acknowledge our own capacity for what we condemn in others, that moral action requires humility rather than certainty, awareness of our own darkness rather than identification with purity. The alchemists, whose work Jung studied extensively, understood this principle. They knew that the gold, the prize of the work, could only be found in the darkest material, in what they called the prima materia, the base, rejected, despised substance. Psychologically, this means that what is most valuable in us is often found in what we have most rejected. That integration of the shadow, of our darkness, is necessary for achieving wholeness, for accessing our full humanity. Jung's concept of the self, the archetype of wholeness, includes both light and dark, both good and evil. The self is not the ego's image of perfection, but the totality of the psyche, including all opposites. Moving toward the self, toward individuation, requires integrating the shadow, which means acknowledging and accepting our capacity for evil while choosing not to act on it unconsciously, while bringing it into consciousness where it can be understood and regulated. This creates a profound moral paradox. We must acknowledge that we are capable of evil without using this acknowledgement as permission to commit evil. We must see clearly our capacity for cruelty, for selfishness, for violence, while choosing to act with compassion, generosity, and peace. This is more difficult than simple moral clarity, than knowing we are good and they are evil. It requires holding tension, requires humility, requires constant vigilance against our own darkness. Jung noticed that the great religious and spiritual traditions understood this. Christianity speaks of original sin, of the inherent fallibility of human nature. Buddhism speaks of the poisons of greed, hatred, and delusion that afflict all beings. These are not pessimistic doctrines, but realistic ones, acknowledging the shadow aspect of human nature so it can be consciously engaged rather than unconsciously enacted. But modern Western culture, Jung argued, had lost this wisdom. It had become identified with progress, with the perfectibility of human nature, with the belief that evil could be eliminated through education, through social reform, through the right political system. This denial of the shadow, this collective refusal to acknowledge the darkness inherent in human nature, created the conditions for the massive eruptions of evil in the 20th century. The collective shadow, Jung warned, accumulates when it is not acknowledged individually. What each person denies in themselves adds to a collective pool of denied darkness. This collective shadow then seeks expression through mass movements, through war, through scapegoating of groups designated as evil. The only antidote is individual shadow work, each person taking responsibility for their own darkness rather than projecting it onto others or onto collectives. This is why Jung insisted that the most important political and social action is psychological work on oneself, facing one's own shadow, withdrawing one's projections, acknowledging one's own capacity for what one condemns in others. This seems like withdrawal from the world, like focusing on personal issues while the world burns. But Jung argued that it is the only thing that actually changes the world because it removes energy from the collective shadow, prevents us from adding to the mass projections that enable atrocities. The dark truth about the shadow and evil is therefore not that humans are inherently evil, not that we should despair about human nature. It is that evil becomes most destructive when it is denied, when we refuse to see it in ourselves, when we project it entirely onto others and then fight them with the certainty that we are fighting darkness while embodying light. The path beyond this destructive dynamic is shadow work, is acknowledging our own darkness, is developing the humility to see that we are not so different from those we condemn, encountering the shadow, the descent. Jung understood that knowing about the shadow intellectually is not the same as encountering it experientially. We can read about the shadow, can understand the theory, can even recognize it operating in our lives, and still never truly face it. True shadow work requires descent, requires a journey into the darkness of the unconscious, requires meeting the rejected aspects of ourselves not as concepts but as living realities. This is the most difficult psychological work there is, and Jung was brutally honest about its dangers and its necessity. The encounter with the shadow typically begins with crisis. Something breaks down in our carefully constructed lives. A relationship fails, a career collapses, an addiction spirals out of control, physical illness manifests, depression descends. These crises are often shadow eruptions, moments when the denied material can no longer be contained, when it breaks through into consciousness with devastating force. Jung saw in these breakdowns not pathology but opportunity, the psyche's attempt to restore wholeness through destroying what has become too one-sided. But the encounter can also be initiated deliberately through what Jung called active imagination, a practice of engaging with unconscious contents through dialogue, visualization, artistic expression. In active imagination, we invite the shadow to appear, to speak, to reveal itself. This requires enormous courage, because we are deliberately opening ourselves to what we have spent our lives avoiding, consciously inviting the monster we have been fleeing. The shadow, when encountered, often appears first as fear. We approach the work and are overwhelmed by anxiety, by the sense that looking at this material will destroy us, will reveal us as fundamentally bad, will confirm our worst suspicions about ourselves. This fear is the ego's defense, its attempt to maintain the split between acceptable and unacceptable, between light and dark. Jung encouraged working through this fear rather than retreating from it, trusting that the psyche has its own wisdom, its own movement toward wholeness. As we begin to acknowledge shadow contents, we typically experience intense shame. We are facing qualities we have defined as unacceptable, are admitting to impulses we have always condemned, are recognizing capacities we have insisted we do not possess. I am selfish. I am cruel. I am capable of violence. I desire what I have always called wrong. These admissions feel like moral failure, like becoming the person we have always feared being. The shame can be so intense that many people retreat at this point, return to denial, re-establish the defenses that kept the shadow hidden. But Jung insisted that this shame must be endured, must be felt fully rather than escaped. The shame reveals the internalized judgments that created the shadow in the first place, the harsh superego that split the psyche into acceptable and unacceptable parts. Working through the shame means questioning these judgments, means asking whether the qualities we have rejected are actually as terrible as we have believed, means developing compassion for ourselves as complex beings containing the full spectrum of human nature. The descent into the shadow also involves anger, often rage at those who shamed us, who taught us that parts of ourselves were unacceptable, who forced us to split and deny in order to be loved or accepted. We feel anger at parents who could not tolerate our full range of emotion, at cultures that demanded conformity, at religions that divided human nature into good and evil, and commanded the suppression of everything defined as evil. This anger is appropriate, but Jung warned against getting stuck in it, against making the work only about blame and victimhood. Dreams become crucial during shadow work. The unconscious presents the shadow in symbolic form, in images and stories that the conscious mind can engage with at a safer distance than direct confrontation would allow. The shadow figure in dreams, often threatening or criminal or primitive, is not an enemy to be defeated, but a part of ourselves to be recognized and integrated. Jung encouraged dialoguing with these dream figures, asking what they want, what they represent, what they have to teach. The process of integration is gradual and often paradoxical. We acknowledge the shadow quality, admit to its presence in ourselves, but we do not necessarily act on it. We recognize our capacity for cruelty without becoming cruel. We admit our selfishness without becoming selfish. We acknowledge our primitive desires without being controlled by them. Integration means bringing the shadow into consciousness where it can be seen, understood, and regulated, rather than leaving it in the unconscious where it operates autonomously. Jung spoke of the need to sacrifice the persona during shadow work, to give up the carefully constructed image of who we are, to risk being seen as we actually are rather than as we wish to appear. This sacrifice feels like death because the persona has functioned as our identity, has been who we thought we were. To let it go is to experience a kind of ego death, a dissolution of the familiar self. But Jung insisted this death is necessary for rebirth, for the emergence of a more authentic self that includes rather than excludes the rejected material. Therapy can provide a container for this work, a relationship in which the shadow can be explored without the therapist condemning or fleeing. The therapist who has done their own shadow work can hold space for the client's darkness without reacting defensively, can see the shadow without being possessed by it, can help the client distinguish between acknowledging impulses and acting on them. But Jung was clear that the therapist cannot do the work for the client, cannot rescue them from the descent, can only accompany them into the darkness. The encounter with the shadow is not a single event, but a lifelong process. There are always deeper layers, always more material that has been denied, always new contexts in which shadow contents emerge. Jung himself, late in life, wrote that he was still discovering shadow aspects he had not previously recognized, still being surprised by what lived in his own unconscious. This is not failure, but the nature of the work. The psyche is vast, and consciousness is always partial, always developing. But there is also danger in shadow work, particularly for those who undertake it without adequate ego strength or without support. The encounter with the shadow can destabilize identity, can trigger psychotic episodes in vulnerable individuals, can lead to inflation where the person identifies with the shadow rather than integrating it. Jung warned against approaching this work casually, against treating it as an interesting experiment rather than as serious psychological work with real risks. The greatest danger is what Jung called enantiodromia, the swing of the pendulum to the opposite extreme. The overly controlled person encounters their wild shadow and becomes completely uncontrolled. The excessively rational person discovers their emotional shadow and becomes overwhelmed by emotion. The deeply moral person faces their capacity for transgression and abandons all moral restraint. This is not integration, but possession by the opposite, another form of one-sidedness rather than wholeness. True integration requires what Jung called the transcendent function, the ability to hold tension between opposites without collapsing into either pole. We acknowledge our darkness while choosing light. We recognize our capacity for evil while acting with compassion. We admit our selfishness while also being generous. We hold the paradox, contain the contradiction, become larger than either the persona or the shadow alone. Integration, making the darkness conscious. Jung's most famous statement about the shadow is also his most challenging. One does not become enlightened by imagining figures of light, but by making the darkness conscious. This is the core of shadow integration, the recognition that wholeness comes not from eliminating darkness, but from bringing it into consciousness, from seeing it clearly, from accepting it as part of ourselves while choosing consciously how to relate to it. Integration begins with a simple but difficult act of recognition. When we feel intense judgment toward another person, we pause and ask, "Is this my shadow?" When we act in ways that contradict our values, we resist the impulse to deny or justify and instead ask, "What part of me acted just then?" When we have strong emotional reactions that seem disproportionate to the situation, we investigate. What have I touched in my own unconscious? This ongoing vigilance, this commitment to self-observation, is the foundation of shadow work. But recognition alone is not enough. Jung insisted that we must also withdraw our projections, must take back onto ourselves the qualities we have attributed to others. This is extraordinarily difficult because projection feels like accurate perception. We genuinely see the other person as having the quality we have disowned. Withdrawing the projection requires entertaining the possibility that what we see in them might actually be in us, that our perception has been shaped by our own rejected material. The practice of withdrawal begins with suspicion of our own certainties. When we are absolutely certain about someone else's badness, when we cannot see any complexity or humanity in them, when our judgment is total and unwavering, this is likely projection. The question is not whether the other person has the quality we perceive. They might, but our reaction, the intensity and certainty of it, reveals our shadow more than it reveals their reality. Integration also requires developing what Jung called the moral imagination, the capacity to imagine ourselves doing what we condemn in others. What would it take for me to betray someone? What circumstances might lead me to act violently? Under what conditions might I lie, steal, harm? These questions are uncomfortable because they force us to recognize that we are not fundamentally different from those we judge, that the difference is often circumstantial rather than essential. But this recognition, far from leading to moral relativism, actually deepens moral capacity. When we acknowledge our own potential for evil, when we see clearly that we too could act badly under certain circumstances, we develop compassion for others' failures, while also developing greater vigilance about our own behavior. We become less judgmental and more responsible, less certain and more humble. Jung taught that integration does not mean acting on shadow impulses. We acknowledge our anger without becoming violent. We recognize our selfishness without becoming selfish. We admit our desire for revenge without seeking it. Integration means the shadow becomes conscious, becomes available to awareness, becomes something we relate to rather than something that possesses us, or something we project onto others. The shadow integrated is the shadow observed, understood, and consciously chosen or rejected rather than unconsciously enacted. Creative work provides one of the most powerful vehicles for shadow integration. Art, writing, music, any form of creative expression can channel shadow energies into constructive form. The rage becomes a painting, the darkness becomes a poem, the destructive impulse becomes a story where it can be explored safely. Jung himself used painting and writing to engage with his own unconscious, giving form to shadow contents that could then be examined and integrated. Ritual also serves integration. Traditional cultures understood this, creating ceremonies and practices that allowed for the controlled expression of shadow energies. Carnival, where normal rules were temporarily suspended. Sacred clowning, where taboos were violated in protected contexts. Rites of passage that honored the dark as well as the light. Modern culture has largely lost these rituals, has few sanctioned spaces for acknowledging and expressing shadow material, and we suffer for this loss. The final stage of integration involves what Jung called the union of opposites, the achievement of a consciousness that can hold both light and dark, both persona and shadow, without identifying completely with either. This is the self, the archetype of wholeness, which includes all polarities, which is neither good nor evil but contains both. Moving toward a self means becoming larger than our contradictions, becoming able to contain paradox, becoming whole rather than merely good. But Jung was clear that this wholeness is never complete, never final. We do not finish shadow work. We do not arrive at a state where all shadow material has been integrated and no more work is needed. The psyche continues to produce shadow contents as long as we are conscious, as long as we continue to identify with some aspects of ourselves and not others. Shadow work is a lifelong commitment, a continuous practice of self-observation, self-honesty, and self-acceptance. The fruits of this work are profound. The person who has integrated significant shadow material becomes more authentic, more whole, more capable of genuine relationship because they are no longer projecting their darkness onto others. They become more creative, more vital, more fully alive because they have access to energies that were previously locked in the unconscious. They become more compassionate because they know their own capacity for what they once condemned in others. They also become more effective morally. The integrated person can act with conviction while maintaining humility, can fight against injustice without self-righteousness, can set boundaries without dehumanizing those who cross them. They are less vulnerable to fanaticism, to moral certainty, to the inflation that comes from identifying completely with the good. They know their own darkness and so are less likely to enact it unconsciously while believing themselves to be serving the light. Jung believed that shadow integration was not just personal therapy but was essential for the survival of civilization. As long as we project our shadow onto groups and nations, as long as we see evil only in others and not in ourselves, we remain vulnerable to the mass movements and collective atrocities that defined the 20th century and that continue to threaten us today. The only antidote is individual work, each person taking responsibility for their own darkness, each person withdrawing their projections, each person choosing consciousness over denial. Conclusion. The dark truth about the shadow is not that it exists, not that we contain capacities for darkness and evil. The dark truth is that we need the shadow, that wholeness requires it, that becoming fully human means embracing what we have rejected, that the path to authentic being leads through the darkness we have been fleeing. Jung's teaching about the shadow is harsh medicine. It offers no comfort, no easy path, no reassurance that we are fundamentally good people with minor flaws. It insists that we are complex, contradictory beings containing both light and dark, both creativity and destructiveness, both love and hatred. It demands that we face what we most fear in ourselves, that we acknowledge capacities we would prefer to deny, that we take responsibility for darkness we have always attributed to others. But this harsh teaching is also liberating. It frees us from the exhausting pretense of being only good, from the burden of maintaining a false self, from the fear that our hidden darkness will be discovered. When we acknowledge the shadow, when we integrate it consciously, we no longer need to hide. We can be authentic, can show ourselves as we are rather than as we wish to appear, can form genuine relationships based on reality rather than on mutual performance of personas. The shadow work is never finished, never complete. There are always deeper layers, always more material that has been denied, always new contexts in which shadow contents emerge. But this is not discouraging. It is the nature of being conscious, of being alive, of being engaged with the full depth and breadth of human experience. Jung taught that the greatest danger is not having a shadow, not containing darkness. The greatest danger is denying it, refusing to see it, projecting it entirely onto others, and then fighting them with the certainty of righteousness. This denial does not eliminate darkness. It makes darkness more powerful, more destructive, more likely to erupt in forms we cannot control. The path forward is consciousness. Make the darkness conscious. Withdraw projections. Acknowledge your capacity for what you condemn in others. Hold the tension between opposites. Become whole rather than merely good. This is difficult work, perhaps the most difficult work there is, but it is also the most necessary for ourselves and for the world. Jung's legacy is not a set of techniques or a therapeutic method, but a vision of human wholeness that includes rather than excludes the darkness, that honors complexity rather than seeking simplicity, that chooses consciousness, even when consciousness is painful. This vision challenges everything our culture teaches us about being good, being successful, being acceptable. But it offers something deeper, the possibility of being real, being whole, being fully human. The shadow is not our enemy. It is our other half, the twin we denied, the complement we need for wholeness. Meeting the shadow, integrating it, learning to live with it consciously. This is the work of individuation, the journey toward becoming who we actually are rather than who we think we should be. And in this becoming, in this movement toward wholeness, we discover something unexpected. The darkness we feared contains not just destructive capacities but creative ones. Not just what is bad, but what is vital. Not just our demons, but our unrealized potentials. The gold, as the alchemists knew, is found in the darkest material. The treasure is hidden in the cave we most fear to enter. Jung's dark truth about the shadow is ultimately a truth about wholeness, about the necessity of including all of ourselves in our becoming, about the courage required to see clearly, and the compassion required to accept what we see. It is a hard teaching, but it is also a hopeful one. Because if we can face our darkness, if we can integrate what we have rejected, if we can become conscious of what we have denied, then we can become whole. And in that wholeness lies our humanity, our creativity, our capacity for genuine relationship, and our hope for a future where we recognize our common darkness rather than projecting it onto enemies we then feel justified in destroying. If this exploration of Jung's shadow has disturbed you, if it has challenged your assumptions about yourself and your goodness, then it has done its work. The shadow work begins with discomfort, with a willingness to question what you have always believed about who you are. Subscribe to this channel if you seek content that explores the depths of Jungian psychology without offering comfortable answers, that honors the difficulty and necessity of shadow work, that invites you into the hard labor of becoming conscious. Share this with someone who is ready for this work, who has the courage to face their own darkness, who understands that wholeness requires more than simply being good. Leave a comment sharing your own encounters with the shadow, moments when you recognized your projections, times when you faced what you had been denying in yourself. This community exists for those willing to do the difficult work of integration, to bring consciousness to what operates in darkness, to become whole rather than merely acceptable. Remember, you have a shadow. Everyone does. This is not moral failure. This is the structure of consciousness itself, the inevitable result of being human. The question is not whether you have a shadow, but whether you will face it, whether you will make the darkness conscious, whether you will withdraw your projections and take responsibility for your own darkness. The work is difficult. It requires courage, honesty, and humility. It means admitting to qualities you have always denied, acknowledging capacities you have always condemned, recognizing that you are not as different from those you judge as you would like to believe. But this work is also liberating, is also the path to authenticity, is also the only way to become whole. Jung's challenge stands: make the darkness conscious, not by imagining figures of light, not by trying to be purely good, not by projecting your shadow onto others, but by facing it directly, by acknowledging it honestly, by integrating it consciously. This is the work of individuation, the journey toward wholeness, the path of becoming fully human. The shadow awaits, not as enemy but as complement, not as demon but as the rejected twin who carries half of what you need for wholeness. Will you face it? Will you make the descent? Will you do the work that Jung knew was essential not just for individual healing but for the healing of the world? The choice, as always, is yours. But the shadow does not wait passively. It will make itself known through projection or possession, through crisis or symptom, through the disruption of what you have carefully constructed. Better to face it consciously, to engage it deliberately, to make the darkness conscious before it makes you unconscious. This is Jung's dark truth, his challenging gift, his necessary teaching. May you have the courage to receive it.